But then he identified a few other virtues which he said were most helpful to society at large, to others. And among these he mentioned humanity, justice, generosity, and public spirit as the qualities most useful to others. Okay. Now, let me tell you a little bit what is the plan for this short presentation. I very much hope to stimulate your thoughts, and I hope we can have a discussion afterwards. I want to essentially divide my remarks in three parts. I was recently interviewed by someone for a book about the financial crisis, and I was asked whether the financial sector weaknesses that had been identified or had been sort of brought out by the crisis have been adequately addressed. And so 1 year later, I would basically like to share with you my own private thinking, my own thoughts as to whether we have in fact addressed these weaknesses. You can probably tell that I will tell you that we haven't. And so I'll just share with you my thinking on some of these issues. I'll try to make that as less technical as possible, but it is not. It's virtually impossible not to go into a little bit of detail if we're going to be raising and trying to answer this fairly fundamental question. The second part I want to do, or the second set of remarks, has to do with some implications of the crisis. The crisis itself has brought certain challenges and opportunities, and I would like to basically just mention quickly in passing what are some of these, and what sort of constraints do they impose, and do they in fact create certain opportunities for us to move to a much better system. And then basically to conclude, what I'd like to do is I'd like to expand on a very provocative, very interesting set of remarks made by Jacques Attali, who's a kind of a French intellectual. He was the first president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and is an advisor to President Sarkozy, and has been an advisor to all former French presidents for as long as I can remember, certainly as long as I have been alive. But Mr. Attali said the following. He said that the core of the international financial crisis is that we have global financial markets and no global rule of law. And in fact, similar statements have been made by others, by Prime Minister Brown, by President Sarkozy, by other senior politicians. And so what I'd like to do in this part of the presentation is basically say, in fact, what are the current mechanisms of international cooperation that we have to deal with global problems? Are they adequate? And if not, what is the way forward in terms of strengthening our ability to mitigate future crises? And this last part of the presentation will be basically the one that I will spend a little bit more time on, because it brings in the whole global governance dimension that you saw in the title. All right? So let me then begin with where are we in terms of the financial crisis. And basically, what I'd like to say here is that I'm not really confident at all that we have moved to the kind of regulatory environment that is necessary to prevent the next crisis. Essentially, we are coming out of a system of financial regulation that was deeply flawed. And let me just mention three dimensions of these flaws. One of them was that loan brokers, mortgage originators, and others working in the system had very few incentives to realistically assess risk. Because in fact what they could do is they could take this risk and pass it on to others. They could just sell it and pass it on to others. This was one of the so-called financial innovations of the system of the past 20 years, which was much celebrated and much commented upon by players in the markets. A second element of this was that investors kind of relied too unthinkingly on very optimistic and unrealistic assessments made of credit risk by the credit rating agencies. And then a third dimension was that regulation and supervision were too concentrated